Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. Today I'm covering Boating Buddies and the Krabby Chronicle. Oh boy. And I'm not saying that because of the Krabby Chronicle. Y'all know why I'm saying that. Boating Buddies. Oh boy. Well, before I start giving my thoughts, before I even get into the proper review, let me go ahead and say that as always, a thank you goes out to everyone watching today. Y'all are very much appreciated by me. And now let's just get right into it. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Starting us off today is one of the most notorious episodes in the show, Boating Buddies. Or maybe it's a step down from one of the most. It's like in the top 5, probably. Top 10 for sure. I could rank the infamous episodes by their infamy to decide this, but that's too logical. I'll just make vague statements that might be wrong instead. Anyway, no matter how infamous it is, it's certainly got a rep. A bad one. And I'm excited to talk about whether that rep holds up. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is how this episode has one of the worst SpongeBob designs in the show to me. I cannot stand this rounded cheeks nonsense. God, I do not like this art style. And I hate to be mean, but it truly does not work for me. At all. SpongeBob just doesn't look right to me. That weird cheek, his mouth is too small, it's just wrong, y'all. When the scene fits, it can enhance SpongeBob's off-putting nature in episodes like this, but the problem is that the scene rarely ever fits. Now, to actually begin reviewing this episode properly, this beginning scene is pretty good. I like seeing SpongeBob groom Gary in a bit of soft domesticity, and I love how Squidward deadpans to SpongeBob about sitting there motionless for 45 minutes. See, I don't mind SpongeBob being on his creepy stuff as long as it's funny, and I've definitely said this before. The interaction between SpongeBob and Squidward shifts somewhat between somewhat funny to just a bit awkward, but still generally leaning towards the, little bit funny side of things. That is, until Squidward starts running away from SpongeBob. Like that one scene in Penny Foolish of SpongeBob picking up the penny, this scene is very weird. And in that episode, this weirdness worked. Here, not so much. It does work in bits and pieces, like the cut to SpongeBob running all cube-like. I don't know how to describe it. That was really funny to me. But it's definitely not the most entertaining scene. I did also like how once Squidward got in the boat, SpongeBob himself addressed a question that we might have been asking about Squidward's recumbent bike. I thought that was a nice touch. I also liked the little reference to boat smarts as well. Then once Squidward gets a ticket and is told to go to boating school, completing the setup of this episode, well, we all know where the episode is going from here. Yep, Squidward and SpongeBob are classmates. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the first thing is that the scene is not very funny or even entertaining. As I've said many, many times, I don't mind if SpongeBob is creepy. That's not my problem here. Just like with any other writing decision, they still need to make it amusing, and so far SpongeBob's creepiness is not during this first scene in boating school. Even the part where SpongeBob breathes creepily is nothing more than slightly off-putting to me. I would even argue that this behavior is beginning to approach being out of character for SpongeBob. And yes, I know that this is a common argument, but it's the fact that I'm arguing it that makes it a bit surprising. Maybe it's because it's not that entertaining, unlike all the other times I've seen SpongeBob be creepy thus far, so it just doesn't feel right. I'm not sure. Anyway, the segment of this scene devoted to introductions is similarly dull, and the part with that random guy who was speeding was awkward and went on too long, and I get that this was the point of the joke, but, the point is to be awkward and a little bit uncomfortable, but it's not working. And hopefully y'all are picking up by now that Season 6 has a lot of these awkward and uncomfortable moments. Sometimes they work, such as the moment in Penny Foolish, but sometimes they don't, as they increasingly aren't. And maybe this just means that I don't like this kind of humor, which could very well be true, but I think the fact that there are moments where I do like it means that it's not completely that. But maybe I just have really high standards for awkward humor specifically. I don't know. But this is a trend I'll continue to keep an eye on as I go through Season 6. Moving on, Squidward's little diagram and story is enjoyable. I liked this part. However, once SpongeBob's turn arrives, that enjoyment I'm feeling goes right back down the drain, and the episode returns to being dull. And this dullness continues through the lunch scene, so boring, until Squidward is in the bathroom and mistakes the big muscular dude in the stall next to him for SpongeBob, which ends up as poorly as you'd expect. And hey, that was funny and amusing. Good job, boating buddies. Okay, I'm being an asshole, I'll stop now. The next few minutes of the episode consist of probably one of its better remembered moments, at least for me, the driving scene. I always love a good chaos scene, especially when it's chaotic driving. I frequently mix this scene up with the scene from Mrs. Puff You're Fired. Not entirely sure why, since they are very different considering the characters involved, but it's something that happens. Anyway, this scene is easily the most interesting and entertaining part of Boating Buddies to me. The way the trio keeps crashing into stuff gives us a lot of neat visual gags. The part with the shrink ray was kind of long, but it was dramatic, so I'll give it that. And it gives a hilarious continuation of Squidward's encounter with the muscular dude from earlier, so that was pretty good. What is not pretty good, however, is the last minute and a half of this episode, which consists of the exam. I can tell that we're meant to feel upset for SpongeBob after Squidward yells at him, but probably to y'all's surprise, I don't. Yes, me, who hates to see SpongeBob sad and mistreated, does not feel bad. And this isn't because SpongeBob was horrible or creepy in this episode, that's not it at all. No, it's because this isn't even close to the worst thing Squidward has ever said to SpongeBob. Him being an asshole to SpongeBob is a large part of their dynamic, and SpongeBob never gets upset at Squidward unless Squidward really hurts him, like in Fools in April. And even in that episode, whether SpongeBob was truly upset is technically up for debate. So it just feels weird seeing SpongeBob actually hurt by Squidward's rudeness here, and in the actual taking of the exam is just kind of boring because we just watch Squidward struggle the whole time without anything amusing or funny happening. And of course, Squidward ends up having to ask SpongeBob for help, but this doesn't work because of SpongeBob throwing Squidward's words back in his face. The part where the guy pulls out the tape recorder was pretty funny, probably the only joke that works in this scene. We sit through all of this only for Squidward to still fail the exam and learn that he'll have to do everything all over again next week. As Squidward's misery reaches a crescendo, the episode ends with a pretty great belting scream from Roger Bumpus, if I do say so myself. And I do. Before I do the ending summary, I'd like to outline what I believe are the three main issues of Boating Buddies: the art, the missed opportunities, and the fact that it's boring and not funny. I already talked about the first and the third issue, so let me go ahead and discuss the second one. Boating Buddies misses the huge opportunity to actually do something with Squidward and Mrs. Puff. All we get is the part where Squidward says that SpongeBob is the bane of his existence, and Mrs. Puff says yours too? Like, hello? And the fact that Mrs. Puff has Squidward ride with SpongeBob even after they shared this brief moment of understanding just makes, no sense. Unless she wanted to be able to commiserate with Squidward about SpongeBob's horrible driving, then it would make sense. But anyway, this episode was a huge missed opportunity to have these two characters interact in a legitimate way, and perhaps that should have been what this episode was about: Squidward and Mrs. Puff bonding over their shared dislike of SpongeBob, and then doing something with that. If I remember correctly, I still don't think this show has properly done anything with that, other than the Seaman Sponge Haters Club, if that's the name of the episode, but that episode barely counts. Okay, now one more thing before the summary. Y'all already know what it is. Let's discuss why this episode is notorious. Like most of the notorious episodes in this show, this episode is called a Squidward torture porn. By now, unless you haven't been watching for very long, y'all probably know I don't fuck with that name. I think the whole idea of it is bullshit, and this episode is no different. Yes, Squidward technically does nothing to deserve the shit he goes through in this episode, but and? I've said this before, but Squidward is the butt monkey of this show. Always has been. Whether he deserves it or not, he's gonna get shat on. That's just how this show works. There's no point in the episode where it feels like things have gone too far, so I have no reason to dislike this episode simply because it tortures Squidward. I have plenty of other reasons to choose from. And speaking of, now I can sum everything up. I'm not this episode's biggest fan, clearly. I don't hate it. I don't really even dislike it necessarily, but I don't really like it. It's just too boring and unfunny, and the missed opportunities really bug me. Boating Buddies is certainly an overhated episode, and one that I find to be hated for the wrong reasons, but what can you do? All I can do is say that this episode belongs best in my mediocre tier, where it comes in with a score of 5.8 out of 10. The Krabby Kronicle is an episode I've always regarded fondly. There's no time that I can remember where I disliked this episode. And considering I've just covered both a slew of notorious episodes and episodes I don't like, this is a welcome change, because I love a good episode that I can simply compliment and move on. And it feels like it's been such a long time since we've had a classic episode focusing on Krusty Krab business practices, so that's another good reason for me to be excited for this review. The Krabby Chronicle begins well enough. It gives us some basic setup that isn't particularly funny, but it is enjoyable to watch. One thing I will say is that there are some pretty nice visual gags in there though, like when Mr. Krabs gets the idea to print his own paper, and as the episode progresses, I start thinking of how low-key ahead of its time it was with the way it portrays news media, because the state of it today is not good. We love an episode that is topical and relevant. One thing I like about this episode is how different it is from other episodes, like its plot is pretty unique and it stands out, at least on a certain level. We've had plenty of episodes where Mr. Krabs exploits SpongeBob, but this is the one, telling lies in the print episode of the show. That plot in itself is a trope, but I think that's why it's only been done this one time. Another reason it stands out is because even though this is an episode about Krusty Krab business practices, it has nothing to do with the food, so this episode doesn't even feel quite like a Krusty Krab episode either. That keeps things interesting and engaging for me, and I also just really like all of the newspaper aesthetics of this episode. Speaking of newspaper aesthetics, SpongeBob's little reporter outfit is so stinking cute, and I love watching him go all around town like a reporter. Tom Kenny is just perfection, what can I say? And I love how SpongeBob has absolutely no eye for news whatsoever, which feels very in character to me, especially when you think of A Life in a Day and how SpongeBob doesn't quite care for the exciting, preferring the mundane. And I know this is the case, or in this case, it's just for comedic purposes, but it's nice to see this bit of character consistency. And then, not to mention, SpongeBob cares about his friends, which is why he decides to go to Patrick and not any of the newsworthy events around, and Patrick's determination to see this random pole move is actually pretty funny. Moving on, the social commentary starts to get particularly loud as Mr. Krabs instructs SpongeBob to embellish the stories. The reference to Idiot Box here was quite nice too. I also liked how this episode kind of diverted a little bit from the normal structure of this kind of episode and showed the consequences of the false stories pretty much immediately with the cut to Mrs. Puff. Another thing I like is that SpongeBob keeps his morals throughout the episode. He's just misled by Mr. Krabs. And later, when he confronts Mr. Krabs, the crab is able to convince him that everything is fine. Seeing SpongeBob get increasingly disillusioned is hard to watch in the best way, because since I of course prefer to see the little guy happy, this makes me anticipate how everything is going to blow up in Mr. Krabs' face. All of the scenes showing how SpongeBob's stories are affecting the subjects are at least entertaining, although I will say that the one with Sandy unfortunately just makes me annoyed because of how dirty SpongeBob did Sandy, even if he's clearly being coerced. I'm noticing a very weird trend of using Sandy's status as a different species to make very thinly veiled references to racist humor, and I don't like it. It happened in No Nose Nose, and it happened here. Squirrel Jokes did it about 10 times better because that was part of the message of the story, but including these kinds of jokes among just the typical jokes of an episode is not the move. Okay, that was my little soapbox. Back to the show. The last minute or so of this episode is absolutely glorious universal justice. After Mr. Krabs pushes SpongeBob too far, SpongeBob turns things around and writes about him, both exposing Mr. Krabs and clearing his own name. Amazing work. I'm basically cheering. Seeing everyone get upset is satisfying and hilarious, especially with the fish that gets all up in Mr. Krabs' face, and then I like the whole bit with Mr. Krabs printing his own money, and that leads into an amazing callback with Patrick coming in because he was conspicuously absent from both the scenes of people's lives being ruined and from the crowd in the end, with his new wife, the pole, and the way SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs just stare at him, just hysterical. The Krabby Chronicle is just a really good episode. I don't know what to tell you. Like, the humor is there, the story is there, the aesthetics are there. It's not my favorite episode by any means, but that hardly means much. The only thing I don't really like in this episode was the part with Sandy because it was a step too far. But outside of that, this episode has got just about everything going for it. That's why I'm placing it in my amazing tier, where it comes in with a score of 9 out of 10. As always, I'll be ending this video with some closing thoughts of mine. I always find a little bit of amusement in having two sister episodes where I have wildly different opinions on them. It's just always a fun point of contrast. Dang, I just said the word always for 3 sentences in a row. Whoops. But really it is fun to observe the range that this show possesses, how it can go from not so good to really great from one episode to another. But yeah, I think I've generally said all that I can say about these two episodes. I guess one thing I can mention is that I hope it's not so obvious how distracted I've been doing these reviews lately. Technically this script and this video won't come out till like 2 weeks after I finished it. But anyway, technically this script is the first I've worked on after getting really hyperfixated on a couple of other personal projects of mine. One of those is a music arrangement because I do those when I'm bored and need to get my creative energy out. I've been trying to give these scripts the attention they deserve, but it can be hard when your brain is yelling at you to do something else. Okay, but that's actually it now. So I'm just going to end the video here, and I'll see you all in the next review.